Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoy this series, make sure you subscribe to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and like us on Facebook to watch our latest interviews. And of course, visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our humanitarian and advocacy efforts across the globe. In 2009, Glenn Kurtz stumbled upon an old family film in his parents' closet in Florida, a brief film shot by his grandfather during a 1938 sightseeing tour to Europe. He had no idea that David Kurtz also captured on color 16-millimeter film the only known moving images of the thriving, predominantly Jewish town of Nasielsk, Poland, his birthplace, shortly before the community's destruction. Glenn Kurtz then set out to restore the film and the people in it. His journey is chronicled in his 2014 book, 3 Minutes in Poland, Discovering a Lost World in a 1938 Family Film, which is the basis for the new documentary film, 3 Minutes, A Lengthening, directed by Bianca Stigter, co-produced by Academy Award-winner Steve McQueen, and narrated by Helena Bonham Carter. I'm excited for Kurtz to speak with me today about his 4-year journey identifying the people in his grandfather's images. 3 Minutes in Poland, the painstaking process of piecing together a world lost to the Shoah and the importance of Stigter's documentary to Holocaust remembrance. Glenn Kurtz is the author of 3 Minutes in Poland, Discovering a Lost World in a 1938 Family Film, which was selected as the best book of 2014 by The New Yorker, The Boston Globe, and NPR. His first book, Practicing, A Musician's Return to Music, published by Knopf in 2007 and Vintage Books in 2008, was hailed by the New York Times and featured on NPR, WNYC, and elsewhere. Kurtz holds a PhD from Stanford University in German Studies and Comparative Literature. He's taught at Stanford University, San Francisco State University, California College of the Arts, and at New York University. He was also a 2016-17 John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellow and a 2019-21 Presidential Fellow at Chapman University. And from 2008 to 2015, he hosted his own Conversations series, Conversations on Practice, about the writing process and the writer's life. Guests included Patti Smith, Jennifer Egan, Arthur Golden, and many others. So it's very fitting that he joins us now. Glenn, thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be with you.
Well, let's start with your own story. Give us a sense of your background, your education, how you honed your storytelling abilities. You were at one point a professional musician and also hosted your own Conversations series with writers and performers that I mentioned in my introduction. Talk to us about your life leading up to 3 Minutes in Poland.
Well, how much time have we got? Well, as you say, my first, I think I've had a number of lives, and my first one was as a musician. I started when I was very young. I played classical guitar, and I was precocious and had some success fairly young. I went to the New England Conservatory of Music, and then I pursued a professional career for several years following that. Everyone says, oh, I love classical guitar. But in fact, there's really very, very few people in the world who succeed at being performing classical guitarists as their profession. Most of the finest classical guitarists out there are teachers to earn their living and also performers. There's really just a couple who succeed as performers only. That, of course, was the goal that I'd set for myself. And at some point in my mid-20s, I had this crisis in which I thought, well, I'm not going to be one of them. And that, because I had so narrowly defined what success was going to mean for me, everything else felt like a failure. And I couldn't bear it. So I quit, which was a really devastating loss for me. And that left me sort of with the necessity to create life number two. And following that, I didn't know what else I would do. I thought the only other thing that I am any good at or care really about, or think that I have a possibility of succeeding at, is being a writer. But I think I was so burned by the loss of my musical aspirations I thought, well, the safe thing to do is to go to graduate school and become a professor. So I went to graduate school. But I think, with all due respect to graduate school and to professorship, which I've sort of been on the margins of my whole life, it wasn't really the career for me, which I understood by the time I was finished with graduate school. I did finish. And then, I started life number 3, in which point I ended up teaching in San Francisco at the Multimedia Studies program. This was in the mid-90s, so in the pre-internet era. But for a variety of reasons, I had some insight into the nature of relational databases, because a friend of mine had been designing one for many years. And so I was involved in the Multimedia Studies program, and actually, therefore, in San Francisco during the kind of dawn of the .com era. So that was life number 3. I ended up working in a .com, which rode all the way up and then all the way down. And then there I was in 2000, having that gone bust as well. And I started life number 4, which was as the writer that I sort of imagined I was going to be when I quit music. So since then, I started writing, practicing, because at that point it'd been more than 10 years since I'd quit music, and it just suddenly dawned on me, this used to be the absolute center of my life. And now it was completely absent. It had been too painful to even touch the instrument. So I started to try to go back to it, and that was the origin of writing, practicing. So when I finished practicing in 2007, I moved to New York and was working on a novel. I had this idea about 2 brothers who were going to escape from Vienna in the days after the German invasion in 1938, the annexation of Austria. And I was kind of stuck with it. And I heard a presentation by Michael Lobenstein, who's now the director of the Film Museum in Vienna, about some found footage. Someone had found an old home movie in a flea market in Vienna, which rather by coincidence had some extraordinary footage of the German march into Austria, which is very, very rare. And he did this sort of forensic investigation of trying to understand who had shot the film. I thought this was a fantastic and interesting story. And I made that the plot of my novel. Somebody finds an old home movie in a flea market and becomes obsessed with trying to identify the people who appear in it. And that leads to this story that I had been trying to write about the brothers escaping from Vienna. And in the course of doing that, I researched, what becomes of old film, what condition would it be in? And in the course of that research, I realized, well, my family had some old home movies. I wonder what happened to them. And that was what led me actually to go searching in my parents' closet for our old home movies. And what I discovered was my grandparents' 1938 home movie of their trip to Europe. And then the story that I was writing happened to me.
Let me stop you there. Well, first of all, let me say Vienna is always a good venue for novels of that period. But let's talk about the book, 3 Minutes in Poland. It's built on the forgotten footage of ordinary life in a small, predominantly Jewish town in Poland. There it is. Thank you for holding it up. Recorded by your grandfather more than 80 years ago. So, where did you find the film? You knew that they had it. Was this in a closet? And what was your reaction the first time you saw it? Or actually, the question that should be asked even before that, what was your reaction? Oftentimes, these films, and every family, I had one, as was a bar mitzvah gift. Everybody had a brownie, a movie camera, and these were 3-minute reels, and everybody had that. But going back after so many years, many of these images had decomposed or became faint. What did you find? Where did you find it? And what did you think when you saw it?
Well, it actually took me 3 trips to my parents' place to find it. But it was ultimately in a cardboard box in a closet, in the back of the closet, together with a bunch of other home movies. My brother is a baby and my parents' wedding and things like that. And there was a label which said 1938 on the aluminum canister that the film was in. But the film itself had fused over time into something like a single mass. It was like a hockey puck. It couldn't be unwound. And consequently, there was no way to view it, even if we had a projector, which of course, by that point, we no longer did. However, sometime in the 1980s, my parents had sent this box to a lab and had the films transferred to VHS. Which is probably how it all ended up in that box in the first place, and nobody had looked at it since then. So I was able to find the VHS that had all of these films on them, and so watched the 1938 film at that point. And yeah, I mean, the moment I saw it, there's a title sequence that says our trip to Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, Poland, France, and England, 1938. And just seeing Poland in 1938 together in a sentence made me realize that this was something important. And then, well, it's a 14-minute long film altogether, and 99% of it is them, waving at the camera in famous places in Europe. But then there are these 3 minutes, and they're so different. They're crowded with people, and it's lively, and just there's so much intensity of kind of life on the street. It's vibrant in a way that my grandparents walking across a lawn somewhere isn't. But just the moment I saw it, I had that sense that anyone seeing this film, I think, would have, which is, we know something that they don't know. And that they're smiling and waving at the camera, these kids and these people in this town, and we know what's going to happen to them. And, you want to scream at them. You want to jump into this frame and just try and save them. And I had that feeling. I felt immediately, I just absolutely wanted to save these people. And there's the devastating realization that the worst has already happened. And then I felt this tremendous sense of responsibility because I had inherited their memory, these images of them. And it was now my responsibility to do something about that. And that if I didn't save them, no one would.
And this footage, in addition to all of the other travel footage, this footage was in Nasielsk. This was in the hometown of your grandfather.
That's right. Although that took me almost a year to determine, but yes.
And what did you in your now you're thinking? It's not only looking at this, knowing what's going to happen, and you're absolutely right that no matter what discussion you have about the Holocaust, no matter how many sites one visits, no matter how many books one reads, we all know that the outcome will not change. The outcome is the same. But this is a hometown. So tell us about Nasielsk. What was Nasielsk in 1938?
Yeah. Well, as I say, it took me quite a while to determine that it was my grandfather's hometown, because the family story was that it was my grandmother's hometown. And I had to search and try and find a survivor from there and show him the footage, to which he said, I've never seen this place before in my life. And so I then had to determine that it was Nasielsk. But once you learn that the name of the town, there's a fair amount that you can learn just historically about, what life was like. So Nasielsk was a town of about 7,500 people, of whom 3,000 or so were Jewish. And that's a little bit misleading because there's the town and then there's the farmland around it. And the 7,500 includes all of the sort of outlying areas, but sort of metropolitan Nasielsk, such as it was at least half Jewish. And we have this image, I think, of a shtetl, which is not the phrase. I tend not to use that phrase precisely for this reason, because we think of, Anatevka at that point, that it's really a 19th century, very backwards kind of farming village. And this was not the case with Nasielsk. It's about 35 miles northwest of Warsaw. There's a railroad junction just outside of town. And so there was a great deal of communication with the capital. It was a somewhat more, it was a trading city, as much as a farming town. So there was a lot of, people had more contact with the outside world, I suppose. Some people had telephones. Some of the delivery men had trucks, not horse-drawn carriages. And there were a couple of cars in town. And there were not one, but two amateur theater companies putting on, among other things, the Dybbuk. So it was a culturally extremely rich, although economically impoverished town, as almost all small Polish towns were at that time, and certainly Jewish towns at that time. And there were all the political parties that you would expect to find in any town of any size with, more than a couple of Jews. You're going to have all of the different political parties. So yeah, it was a vibrant, culturally rich town. And ultimately, all of the people that I spoke with from that town, both survivors and people who had emigrated before, spoke very warmly, actually, of the life there. Obviously not of what happened, but they thought of it as a lively place, as a nice place to be.
So you could have seen the film. You could have felt, well, now, in that sense, a final chapter has been written. The idea of closure, it could have been within your family, and it would have been nice had it been that way. But you decided that you wanted to go one step beyond that, and you began a 4-year journey to identify the people in these images. And so, where did your search take you? With whom did you end up speaking, and what were the results of that odyssey? And how did those findings shape the story that you tell in 3 Minutes in Poland?
Wow. Well, there's an awful lot to that. Goodness, as I said, if you know the name of the town, you can learn a lot of things. And so I wanted to be able to identify the people, but how do you identify people in a film if you don't know who they are, right? It's just impossible. It's one of those crazy, sort of conundrums that if you don't know what you're looking at, then you don't know what you're looking at. And so for that reason, so much footage of pre-war Poland, or of Jewish communities in pre-war Poland, it's just generic, right? Like, we see a town, we see people doing generic things. We don't see a certain person in a certain place at a certain time, which is in fact what the film is showing us, but we don't know. So I really wanted to rescue the footage from this generic quality that so much of the footage of that era has. But yeah, how do you do it? I was able to find in the course of my research all sorts of lists, the business directory, for example, which would list all the names, all of the people who had businesses in the town. I found correspondence of the Landsmannschaft, right? So the group of immigrants who had come to the US and now were sending money or support and some back to their relatives in the old country. And, lists of who was sending how much money and who it was intended for and who had the right and the responsibility to distribute those funds and things like that. So I was able to find lots and lots of names. But to go from names on a list to faces in a film is an absolutely unbridgeable gap if you don't have someone who can provide that connection for you. So I searched and I gathered and I got as much information as I could. And 2.5 years after searching, I felt like I'd gone as far as I could go, that, I hadn't been able to find a survivor who could help me. I did speak with one survivor. It was a woman who had been born in 1932. So she was only 6 years old when my grandparents visited, 7 years old when the war started, 15 years old when the war ended. And she was the sole survivor of her family. She came to the United States, was adopted as by a foster family, and spent the rest of her life trying to forget what had happened before her life in America started. So when I showed her the film, she literally could not even identify the town that she had been born in. So I thought, I've gone as far as I can go. I have this extraordinary piece of evidence, and I'll never know what it's evidence of. And then out of the blue, I got an email from a young woman in Detroit who had seen the footage on the website of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I'd donated the original footage, and who'd had it restored and digitized. And in watching this film, when the camera pans across this group of kids jumping and waving in the market square, one face leapt out at her, and that's her grandfather. And he's still alive. He was alive. He was 87 years old then. That was in 2012, and he's 98 now. And that's he was born Moshe Tuchendler in 1924. Ultimately became Maurice Chandler in the United States. And I got to speak to him moments after he saw the film for the first time, and the first thing he said to me was, "You've given me back my childhood." And because he also was the sole survivor of his family and lost everything and everyone. and had no one to communicate what his life had been like with. And I think even as a survivor, just the trauma of what happened, so having pushed that earlier period into the background, made it feel somewhat mythological to him. And now suddenly here he was, surrounded by people that he knew. The extraordinary thing is that Mr. Chandler has a photographic memory, and he was able to identify people and give names and dates and places and tell stories about their lives, and stories obviously about people who were important to his family who don't happen to appear in the film, but also some of the people who were in the film. And he became, what I call in the book, the Rosetta Stone. He was the one who made all of the research that I had done before that become suddenly really useful. In fact, I'd found some documents in which his name appeared, his signature appeared, which I was able to give back to him, which he found rather extraordinary, these things resurfacing after all of this time. And so with his help and with a great deal of additional luck, ultimately I met 7 additional survivors. And recorded their stories and shared their stories with each other. And so there was this kind of sudden, these moments of extraordinary synchronicity when someone would remember something and one of the other survivors, it would spur their memory and they'd remember something, or things would link up in little pieces of fragments of stories, or, insights into the nature of the town would kind of pop into view in a way that just would otherwise never have been possible.
Was there something that you heard that you didn't expect to hear? I mean, I
didn't expect to hear any of it. Everything I heard, I didn't expect to hear. And the quality, I had no idea when I started that I would find any of this. And then, what you sort of realize very quickly, especially with someone like Mr. Chandler, whose memory is so prodigious and so precise. I've been talking with him for more than 10 years now, and I still learn things from him every time we speak. The possibility of grasping one person's experience of their childhood it's impossible. You can never do it. There's so much there, and there's so much that's incommunicable, even if you can remember it quite distinctly. You can't convey it to someone who doesn't know or hasn't been there. And so, the more and more we talked, the deeper into the sort of this intangible texture of what life was like sort of became this kind of holy grail, this very ephemeral thing that you realize, man, this is just one man, There were 3,000 people who lived in this town.
Yeah, and at what point, Glenn, were they rounded up? Where was this on the calendar?
Well, it's extraordinary. Because of this railway junction right outside of the town, which connected to the capital, Nasielsk was occupied almost immediately after the German invasion. The Germans invaded on September 1st. By September 3rd, Nasielsk was occupied by the Germans. And it happens that the territory that contains Nasielsk was annexed to Germany at the end of the Polish campaign in October 1939. And Heinrich Himmler issued an order saying that the annexed territories should become Judenrein, right, free of Jews, before the end of the year. So it was 3 months after the German invasion. They invaded on September 1st, 1939, and on December 3rd, 1939, the Jewish community of Nasielsk was deported from the town.
Wow. Early. Wow.
It's just 3 months. It's incredible. And so the fate of that community, at that point, Poland is divided between the Soviet zone and the German occupied zone, because the Soviets invade on September 17th and occupy half of Poland. And Poland is then effectively divided into 3. There's the Soviet zone, the German zone, and the annexed territories. The German zone is what became the general government, the German occupied Poland, more or less in central Poland. And so the deportees from Nasielsk in December, they had no idea what to do with these people at that point. There were no concentration camps in Poland yet. There were no ghettos in Poland yet. They just shunted them around railway stations for about a week and then finally dumped them into these towns in central Poland. Lukov and Miedzej, very hard to say for an American. So those were just towns that had their own Jewish populations, and the people who were sent there were refugees, and they were accommodated by the local community as best as they could. Eventually, those two towns became what were called transit ghettos, rather famous transit ghettos, Lukov is in particular. And they would be filled and then emptied, and then filled again and emptied. They were in essence holding tanks. So eventually on August 25th, 1942, the majority of the Jews from Nasielsk, along with 10,000 Jews from other Polish towns, were put on boxcars and sent to Treblinka, where they were murdered on arrival.
Let's talk about the film, 3 Minutes, A Lengthening, which has many moving parts. When you were approached about adapting your book and your grandfather's footage for a documentary, how did that happen? Who made the phone call and said, "This is a great idea. Let's do this"?
Well, one thing about this footage, as you mentioned in your intro, at least half of it is in color, which is very, very rare. And some of the color corrections are very, very sharp. So this is very attractive footage from filmmakers' point of view. And so I've been approached actually quite a bit by people who wanted to make films with this footage. And I was honestly very, very skeptical at first, precisely because of the reasons that I mentioned before about how I was so committed to preserving the identities of these people as individuals, not as generic representatives. I always wanted to be able to say, who are we looking at? Who is this person and what happened to them specifically? I didn't want to kind of feed into this generalized, like, oh, we know who they are and we know what happened to them feeling that I think you get from so much Holocaust documentary. So I was very, very hesitant to allow the footage to be used if I didn't believe in the method of the people making the film. However, so it was in 2014, shortly after the book came out, that I got an email from Bianca, and she expressed her interest in making a film. And I looked her up, and she's a historian by training, and a very respected historian in the Netherlands, and a film critic by profession, not a filmmaker. So I agreed to talk with her, and we had a couple of conversations, and almost immediately I recognized a sort of kindred spirit and a sympathetic approach, that for her this was about respecting the individuality of the people. And so I agreed to work with her. She had been invited by the Rotterdam Film Festival as a film critic to create a film essay, so a short 25-minute essay on film about film. And typically you would sort of do a voiceover of some contemporary film and do an analysis, and she wasn't interested in doing that. And she proposed to them that she take this footage from my grandfather and try and stretch it into the length of time for the film essay. So in essence, the concept of 3 minutes, a lengthening, was there from the very first. That was her original idea, and that was what we agreed to work on, and that got screened in Rotterdam in 2015, a 25-minute version. And then she felt, I think, that there was still more to do. And she secured funding and continued working for another 4 years, and created the film that we see today.
Co-produced by Academy Award-winner Steve McQueen and narrated by Helena Bonham Carter. It's received stellar reviews. I'm curious, though, how did you make sure that the documentary did your story and your grandfather's story justice? How did that work?
Well, we worked together, and Bianca shared with me the rough cuts of the film at many different stages of its production, and I was able to give comments. But honestly, once we had worked together on that brief version, and obviously she interviewed me, and I got her in touch, and we went and visited Mr. Dandler, and she interviewed him as well. And I shared my archive with her of interviews with the other survivors. So it was, we were collaborating on gathering the material for the footage. I mean, for the script together. So I think, yeah, it was just, it kind of was an organic process. And I trusted her. That was the main point. From the beginning, I believed in her sensitivity and in the mission that, the vision that she had created for herself with this footage. So
I'm interested to hear your take on the central theme of the movie made about the film 3 Minutes, A Lengthening. How does our knowledge of subsequent events, the genocide of the people of Nasielsk in the Holocaust, which we've just talked about, radically alter one's perception of the slice of ordinary life depicted in the movie? In your view, does the movie represent, as many films do, a kind of mystical experience with the past? Is it a reconnecting with the past? Is it, let's say our generation, a bonding, if I can use the word, bonding with the people in the film? How does it strike you, and how would you like it to strike the viewer?
Well, film is such a strange medium because it has this sense of immediacy, which is false. You feel like you're seeing these people and you're there with these people, and you're not. And that's one of the great allures of film, and one of the great features of feature films is that you can lose yourself in that belief for a little while. I think it's also a great danger, because you can forget that you're not, in fact, there, and believe that you have a kind of connection that then and you don't really have. So I think that this sort of divided reality that's just in the nature of film in general is so intensely heightened with this kind of footage, because we see the people and nothing bad happens in my grandfather's film. It's a perfectly charming, very amateurish view of a day in this town, and the kids are laughing and everybody's waving and everybody's having a good time. And as I said at the very beginning, the moment I saw it for the first time, you have this double sense of, well, enjoying the fact that the kids are having fun. I mean, you laugh. There's no, you can't help it. There are funny things that happen in this little snippet, and the horror that's awaiting them. And so I think the nature of this footage just intensifies that duality, that we feel like we're there with them, and we know what's going to happen, and that makes us feel excluded from the film, like we can't reach in and save them. So I think that that's one of the sources of the intensity that people experience when they watch this footage. And then, of course, there's the charm. I mean, and both of those are intensified. There's the charmingness of it. So you watch it over and over, and you feel like you start to know these people, and you have your favorite characters, and they come back again and again, and it's enjoyable. You sort of feel like they become people. So that in the end is what I hope people experience from it. And that
one of the thoughts that I had, think about 1938, home movies here in the United States were still not the norm. Not everybody had a camera. Maybe everybody's favorite uncle had a camera a little bit later on, and then we got our own cameras and so forth. But in 1930, especially for somebody to bring in, and this was not a professional film crew that came in, this was your grandfather, and he's got this 16 millimeter camera, and this must have been, for those townspeople, an occasion.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mr. Chandler talks about it. I mean, he's in the film, but he doesn't remember that day. But you can see it on his face. This is something absolutely exciting. First of all, Americans have come to town. It's a small town, doesn't get a lot of visitors, and it's always an event when an American comes to town. But an American with a movie camera, again, this was not a backward town. There was a cinema in town. They knew what movies are. It wasn't like they had never, heard of the films before. But probably nobody had ever come to film them. And so for the kids, this was just an absolute, life, it was the greatest thing that had ever happened. So yeah, I mean, I think, we can say that my grandfather filmed an ordinary day in town, but its very presence and the presence of the movie camera made it an extraordinary day in town. But for that reason, because he was a sort of, he had been born there, and they were traveling, my grandparents were traveling with a couple of friends above Mr. Molina, my grandfather's boyhood friend, who was also born in Nasielsk. They all spoke Yiddish still. So they were accepted as members of the community, and they were not foreigners exactly, right? They were distinguished visitors. And as a result, the nature of the behavior that we see is much more natural than if a film crew had come in, let alone a propaganda crew, So yeah, I think there's something about that.
What do you think makes this story important, not only as a memorial, but as a focal point for moving Holocaust awareness into the next generation?
Yeah. Well, as I was sort of emphasizing all along, what is most important to me is that we recognize that these are individuals. I think one of the things that we're at a new era in kind of Holocaust historiography, writing of the Holocaust. The sort of first era was just so kind of institutional. We had to understand what happened and how did it happen, and we thought about the 6 million. And I think in this generation, what I'll call the grandchildren's generation, the third generation, it's much more about personal stories. There's, any number of my grandparents' war or my grandparents' story books that are out there and films that are out there. I think that the most important thing is to remember, the way I put it is, there was not one Holocaust of 6 million people. There were 6 million Holocausts of one person. Everyone's story, although there are these generic similarities, is different. And the world that was lost in that individual Holocaust is a unique one and an irreplaceable one. And as I said about Mr. Chandler, an incalculable one. You cannot come to terms with the magnitude of what's lost when a single life is lost. So to even understand the nature of that, and to approach these people as individuals, I think that's the most important thing. And as the survivor generation passes, I think the sensitivity to that individuality also tends to weaken, and the whole thing becomes kind of mythological. And I hope that this stands as kind of a factual engagement with these people as individuals, as a sort of bulwark, as a memorial, in the face of that sort of washing away of individuality that happens.
So how can our audience watch 3 Minutes A Lengthening? I believe it's available on streaming platforms like Hulu, but tell us where else we can find it, and of course, your book as well.
Well, my book is available at fine bookstores everywhere, or online. You can find it anywhere, or ask your local bookstore to order it, or the other places that people get books. The film also is out on DVD, which is available again through the places where people buy those sorts of things. It's on streaming platforms. It's on Canopy as well. And it's playing at a variety of film festivals. I think it's actually going to be streamed on the BBC at the end of this month, January. It's going to be streamed on national television in Poland. Also, I think at the end of this month. So it had been in theaters over the summer, but now I think it's in more specific release. So if you want to see it live in the theater, I think you have to look at your local listings, or you can go to 3minutesfilm.com and request a screening for your community, which is also, I think, a fine option.
When we began this conversation, I think you said that you had gone through 4 lives. Is there a 5th life for Glenn Kurtz? What is the next project?
Well, I like life number 4 as a writer, so I hope that it lasts a good long time. I have, over the course of the pandemic, I actually wrote 2 additional books, both about the Empire State Building, one of which is a novel, and the other is nonfiction. And the nonfiction has some generic similarities to 3 Minutes in Poland. and it's about the men who built the Empire State Building, the actual workers, about whom we know nothing, and of whose names we have almost no record. But we have these magnificent photographs by the photographer Louis Hine, which even if you don't know his name, you have certainly seen these photographs of the construction of the Empire State Building. These men, all of whom were presented in these photographs anonymously, but I've managed to determine who they were. So I've written a book about those photographs and about the men who appear in them.
Well, the book is 3 Minutes in Poland, Discovering a Lost World in a 1938 Family Film. It's available, again, wherever you purchase books. And you can stream the film based on the book, 3 Minutes, A Lengthening, on Hulu, Apple TV, Amazon Prime Video, all of the platforms that Glenn has talked about. Glenn Kurtz, thank you for sharing your incredible story with us. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, our thanks again to author Glenn Kurtz and to you for watching this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this interview, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and by liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guest, Glenn Kurtz, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Join us again soon.